Look, we have an interesting session coming up. So 2 speakers, both speaking about drug reform. And I think that this is a very interesting topic on the Conservative side of politics. I mean, as a doctor, I see this at a day-to-day level. And it is probably one that, potentially would create a significant disagreement. So I think this will be a very interesting segment. So I'd like to introduce, both speakers will speak for about 10 to 15 minutes. And there's likely to be a bit of time for questions. So feel free to think of some there. We should have time for 2 or 3 questions afterwards. So look, our first speaker speaking on this issue is not the obvious person you'd expect to come out talking about drug liberalisation. He's the former Premier of Queensland. Prior to that, he was the Mayor of Brisbane. He's got several hats at the moment. He was a civil engineer in the Army, and now he works across the board. He commentates on Sky News, he's involved in startups, and he's also involved in commercial property. But today, please welcome former Premier Campbell Newman.
Well, thanks very much, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's great to be here, and I just want to commend the organisers for bringing us together. You've done a wonderful job, and for you, ladies and gentlemen, just reflecting what Craig was saying, it's just so important at this time in our history that people who believe in what's right in our community, who have values, who know about the benefits of hard and positive work and achievement and aspiration, come together to continue to fight the regressive left. So well done on being here. But I can't go on, and I know everyone else seems to have done it, but I must as well acknowledge a very important person for this conference, and that is, of course, Senator Christina Keneally. Thank you, Senator, thank you. We applaud you, because next year there will be twice as many people at this conference. I can confidently predict it. Now, I am meant to talk about drugs, so I'm moving fairly quickly here, and I think my drug bit's fairly succinct, so I'm sure the organisers won't mind if for a moment I talk about the climate challenge or the climate emergency, because I thought on a weekend when we're seeing one of the most prolific snow dumps in recent memory, I think I should take a walk down memory lane for you. So this is the headline in the Canberra Times on Sunday, the 6th of November 1988, "Building must halt on the ski fields." And I'll just read you a couple of paragraphs. "There should be a moratorium on further development in Australia's ski fields until the likely impact of the greenhouse effect is known, according to a workshop of the Canberra meeting of the National Greenhouse 88 Conference. Many scientists predict that Australia's skiable snowfields will be wiped out by the warmer climate expected to be created by the greenhouse effect within 40 years. So they've got about 8 years to go by my reckoning to get to the point where we should stop that development of the ski fields. But the other one, of course, was that fantastic conference in Melbourne. I'm referring to Greenhouse 87, where, again in the Canberra Times, 7th of December, scientists warn of floods, fire, cyclones and disease. So that was 32 years ago almost. You'll be interested, ladies and gentlemen, to know that by now there's meant to be every year, what was then a 1 in 50 bushfire season was going to happen every single year. Sea levels were going to go up to the extent that more than 50,000 square kilometres of Australia's coastline was flooded. But importantly, and this is something you should take home, just because we don't want to be leaving here negatively, on a brighter note, December 87, talking about climate change, Professor David Hopley of James Cook University said the Great Barrier Reef would become more beautiful and prolific with a rise in water level and predicted increase in water temperature. There you go, you see. So there were some positives indeed out of Greenhouse 87. So, to the topic at hand. I want to be very, very clear this afternoon that I don't encourage anyone to take drugs, and nor would I want any policy change that would increase their use or the misery they inflict within their community. However, and I really urge you, if you don't agree with me this afternoon, at least start to have a think about this. It's time to face facts that 40 years of a war on drugs in this nation has not curtailed the use of illicit drugs in this nation. Not at all. Governments have toughened penalties, introduced mandatory sentences, expanded the jails, thrown more dollars at police and border security, and what has been the result? I would argue, and you've got to agree with this, that drugs are more plentiful, accessible, and this is really pertinent and very worrying, more affordable than ever before. In fact, any young person, I've got two daughters in their 20s, one is living in London but one's still at home, and she, particularly the one that's at home, will tells us and any other young person will tell you that recreational drugs have become the preferred choice of the 20-somethings over alcohol because they are cheaper. If you doubt what I'm saying, here's the challenge, and actually this is quite rhetorical. I'm not suggesting you go and try this, but if we could send a 20-something into the streets around this hotel, and I'm sure that within 15 or 20 minutes, with the use of social media, a couple of contacts, they could come back with some sort of illicit drug, ice or cocaine. But you know what? If we said, go and get some Panadine, thanks to the federal government, we'd be off to a doctor, we'd get a prescription, we'd go down to the pharmacy, we'd get a lecture from the pharmacist on duty about, have you taken this before? And we're worried about codeine addiction. Is there some sort of bizarre problem going on here? So my point is this: a generation of our young, our precious young, would prefer to risk their health popping pills mixed up in garbage cans in residential basements and out-of-the-way industrial estates. Drugs manufactured by people who barely got through high school, let alone having a university degree in chemistry. Tragically, we then see promising lives lost and loved ones and friends, families traumatised. And also for so many, many families, it's the heartache entailed in supporting a family member through their ice addiction. And yet, despite it being against the law and the tragedies we see in the media, it's not as if it wasn't covered, people continue to buy and take these dangerous, dangerous shonky products. And we've seen this in these festivals this year, young lives being lost. So my thesis, my point to you this afternoon is that the current policies are not working, period. They are not working. But before we hypocritically point the finger at the young and say, you know, you're taking drugs, don't take drugs, they're bad, we should also fess up to the fact that there are plenty of older people in our midst, professionals and blue-collar workers alike, who regularly use drugs as well. Everyone knows the drugs are illegal, but the stats show there are plenty of our fellow Australians who prefer to snort, swallow, or, God forbid, inject drugs rather than enjoy a beer, a wine, or a whiskey, which I'm very partial to. Meantime, the vast sums of money involved have encouraged a huge black market and shadow economy and the proliferation of extensive criminal enterprises. So much is at stake. It's clearly got the potential, the real potential, to corrupt our law enforcement bodies and the legal system itself. It certainly sees a proliferation of crime, break-and-enters, etc., in our suburbs as people steal to feed a habit. I'm a keen student of history, and prohibition in the 1920s and 30s in the United States provides some real insights on this issue. Prohibition was brought in because alcohol and drunkenness was destroying families and lives. There was a movement, a prohibition movement, a temperance movement that grew from the 1860s, 1870s onwards, the Anti-Saloon League. However, prohibition and the ban fostered the growth in criminal enterprises and saw a significant increase in crime in the major cities of the US. It fostered corruption of the police, the judiciary, the legal system itself. And a significant proportion of the community continued to enjoy alcohol, thereby, by definition, becoming criminals. The benefits of the ban were clearly outweighed by the negative impacts, and ultimately the ban was repealed. And if you really want to get into this yourself and have a look at it, I really encourage you, go on to Netflix. There's a 3-part series on prohibition done by PBS in the United States. It is most illuminating when you marry it up against the drug issue in Australia and indeed the Western world. So, ladies and gentlemen, a better understanding of this history and a reflection on my time in local and state government has led me to conclude that prohibition doesn't work, it will never work, and we must instead approach this as a public health issue. And if anybody has had a real go at driving criminal gangs who make drugs out of a state, it was yours truly with the criminal motorcycle gangs. And I'm confident, by the way, we could have continued on that push rather than see them come back into Queensland. But at the end of the day, the rewards for this criminal activity are so great that they will continue to prosper where government falters. Politicians continue to talk tough. I was there and have resisted any change to our strategy. It's politically non-doable. It's a lightning rod sort of issue that supposedly will destroy political careers and parties. But I say to you, and I'm winding up now, if we continue to do the same things, people will continue to use drugs, they will continue to suffer harm or sadly die, and families and friends will continue to grieve. So it's disappointing in the extreme to see the elected officials retreating always to their corners, taking the safe option about getting tough on the drug issue, but refusing to countenance even a sensible, rational debate on this subject. It's up to us in the community to help them find the courage to take on this issue and try some new things. And this afternoon, I simply ask you to consider what I've put forward, and perhaps you can be part of that debate as well. Thank you again for attending CPAC.
Thank you so much, former Premier Campbell Newman. Yeah, I'll ask you to take a seat because we will have some questions later. I'll bring up our second speaker on this topic. Some of you will be familiar, especially those from Victoria. He's the preeminent figure of the Liberal Democrats. He's a member of the upper house in Victoria, and for many years he worked in business intelligence in the finance sector. Please welcome the Honourable David Limbrick.
Thank you so much, Tanvi, and it's wonderful to be here today and see so many people talking about different issues. Contrary to the media reports, there does seem to be a bit of a diversity of opinion here. And a few years ago, I could never have imagined myself being on a stage with Campbell Newman talking about drugs and sort of agreeing with each other. So that I'd never imagined that. And so to add to the diversity, I'll be upfront. I'm not a conservative. I don't identify as a conservative. I'm a libertarian. And so I'm really delighted to have been invited here. And so I'll start off on a similar note to Mr. Newman, that I'm not here to convince you that drugs don't cause harm. They do. I readily concede this fact. Even in the case of soft drugs such as cannabis, there's potential harms. And what I'd like to discuss, though, and what I think people aren't discussing enough, is what are the harms caused by our drug laws. The drug laws themselves cause harm. And I think that there's a particular area of drug law reform that can gain both broad support and help reduce these harms. And so I'd like to focus on this one area that I think both conservatives, libertarians and the left can come to some level of agreement on, and that is decriminalisation. And so my party, the Liberal Democrats, has always supported decriminalisation, and we do it on a moral issue around the principles of individual liberty and self-ownership. However, I've noticed a trend in recent times where we're seeing more conservatives also changing their mind on this issue, and you're one of those people, Mr. Newman. So that's great to see. And You may be aware that the great economist Milton Friedman once said, I'll quote, if you look at the drug war from a purely economic point of view, the role of government is to protect the drug cartel. That's literally true, that's what he said. And more recently, he was up here earlier, the Honourable Mr. Craig Kelly decided decriminalisation was the way to go after visiting Portugal, where drugs are still illegal but decriminalised. And he noted that there had been 1,808 drug-induced deaths in Australia in 2016, and he said, I quote, if Australia had the same drug-induced death rate as Portugal, we would have had 1,735 less deaths in 2016 alone. That's a lot. He continued, logic tells you that decriminalising drug use is not conducive and you end up with more problems at the periphery, but the actual results in Portugal show that this has not occurred. Also, the American conservative Ben Shapiro has noted, I've been, and I quote, I've been in favour of decriminalisation of marijuana for years. The federal and state governments spend far too much time and effort trying to go after marijuana, and they do a terrible job of it. Broadcaster Alan Jones has said, and I quote, all I'm saying is anything we've tried to date has failed. What should we be doing? The current system isn't working. We need to do something to break this cycle. What we're doing isn't working. And like Alan Jones, I think many Conservatives are taking a pragmatic position that the current system does not work. They understand that it's absurd to come to any other conclusion. But what is the other option? Is it to increase the intensity of the war on drugs? And let's have a think for a moment about what that would really look like. Many Asian and Middle Eastern countries have the death penalty for possession of drugs, yet they still have drugs. In the Philippines, vigilantes murder drug users, yet they still have drugs. In prison, where people are locked in cages, have nearly all their liberty taken away, they still have drugs even in prison. And you have to ask yourself, how much liberty are you willing to trade for security, and how effective will that really be? And conversely, if we look at the other side, what is the minimal change to drug laws that could credibly be called decriminalisation? Well, in my home state of Victoria, the police already have the ability to caution someone caught with a small amount of drugs for personal use. Decriminalisation may not even require changes to the law. It could be as simple as the police minister issuing a directive to the police to issue cautions in all cases instead of cases by discretion. Arresting and charging people for personal possession has enormous consequences for all concerned and does little to actually stop drug users consuming them. It interferes in our justice system by wasting police, court and prison resources and costing taxpayers a fortune for little effect. It certainly doesn't help drug users. Someone who ends up with a criminal record for possession and possibly even serving time ends up with a lifetime stigma, which harms their possibility of rehabilitation and prevents them from gaining employment and living a productive life. It's often said that the best form of welfare is a job. But laws that prevent someone from getting a job, from making a mistake that harm no one other than themselves, should give anyone pause for thought. Consigning someone to a lifetime dependency on welfare like this should not be supported by any decent person, regardless of their politics. I recently spoke with a medical professional who helps people who are addicted to heroin. We often hear about the deaths caused by drug overdoses, but something that I learned and really shocked me was the level of brain damage caused by overdoses. He said that around 20% of his patients have brain damage caused by this. Heroin itself doesn't directly damage the brain so much, but rather when someone overdoses, their breathing becomes shallow, their oxygen levels drop, and it causes damage to their brain. In some cases, this results in death, but in many others, this can cause varying levels of brain damage. Can you imagine the effect on someone's life when they suffer this type of injury? The professional I spoke to told me anecdotes of drug users who suffered an overdose and the next day their personality totally changed due to brain damage. Depending on the level of damage, they may never again be a functioning member of society. The worst part is that in most cases it's totally preventable. Giving oxygen treatment or administering the drug naloxone can reverse the effects of overdose and prevent this type of harm. Current drug laws increase the probability that someone taking heroin does it in a back street instead of in the proximity of a medical professional that can administer these treatments. In reality, what we all want is less harm and costs to our society that are caused by drugs. The reasonable and considered person must confront the question, are our current drug laws increasing the harms caused by drugs? The thing I'd like you to take away from today, from everything that I've said, is that it's okay, I think, to support drug decriminalisation and be a conservative. In fact, it's better than okay, it's just a common sense position. Thank you.
Thanks so much, David. Given it's something I work in closely, I'll just add a few points to some of what you've heard. Certainly in my job, it does not feel like a war on drugs, and I think it's an American term often imported here in the debate, when in the field, I would say for most of our colleagues, it does not feel like some big criminal. Our psychiatric hospital emergency departments are full of people on marijuana, amphetamines, and none of them go to jail, very few of them get charged. Likewise, so many of our patients, if you offer a treatment plan to a magistrate, almost none of them will go to jail or even get charged. They'll usually get off. So I'd question the whole idea of war on drugs in Australia. I think it's an American term that's often imported here in our debates when it's very different in terms of how punitive we are. A couple other things I'd add for the health thing. Some of you, many of you will probably read my colleague Anthony Daniels, who writes under the pseudonym Theodore Dalrymple, and he had a line where he said, nobody's cured more addicts than Chairman Mao, who threatened to hang them. And nobody's suggesting that, but the point is you couldn't do that with tuberculosis. You couldn't just threaten to hang them and suddenly cure all these people with tuberculosis. The point being it's not a typical health issue. It's a special kind of voluntary activity, if you like. The best results for addiction are in pilots and doctors who have strong incentives to get their jobs back, but then they get better when there's very strict testing, urine testing, and very strong penalties regarding their licences. They have the highest rates of improvement. So it's a point that carrots and sticks are the best form of treatment. And the vast majority of who actually get off, are cured of addiction, do it voluntarily without any treatment. So these are challenges for the idea that it's entirely a health issue. And one other point, given we've, certainly religion has been a theme throughout this conference, I think an interesting thing about, it's not just about price regarding ecstasy or LSD and dance parties. I'd argue, and this is something Jonathan Haidt has written about, that in such a profane secular culture, one of the few areas they get a sense of transcendence and awe is through drug taking and dance parties. So I think that's another challenge to some of the structures of our society. It's not just about kind of cheap thrills or price. So look, a few of my points, but look, I think we do have time. I'm not sure if Andrew's here, but we do have time for some questions. And I'm not sure if there's mics in the crowd, but I'll just run it if you like. Yes, sir, go. Why don't you stand up and please keep it short.
To the first point about children and medication, I don't know if there's a link there or not between, prescriptions and things when they get older. I'm not certain about that. I know that I've had contact with families that have had these sort of issues, and drugs that have been prescribed for their children have been very successful in their treatment. So, yeah, I'm not sure I want to. I'm not a medical expert, so I don't want to. Yeah, well, I don't want to pretend I'm a doctor. Yeah, and so on the second point with the drug testing, I think one of the problems with the drug testing, and we see this in the roadside drug testing, is that it doesn't test for impairment. A lot of these tests, they test for whether you've had drugs in the recent past, and with the roadside drug testing, it tests whether you've smoked marijuana 2 or 3 days ago. It's very different to blood alcohol testing, and so you end up in this situation where the objective is to test whether someone's fit to operate machinery or do things like that, when in reality what you're testing is whether they're a drug user. And I think that's a big problem. The problem here is really around the testing technology, and that's one reason why we've actually spoken out against the drug driving testing in Victoria.
Do you want to say anything, Campbell?
Just very quick. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you. Yeah, you go.
Look, just in terms of the first point, for me, the role of the family, critically important. The way we bring up our kids and the values that we inculcate in them is the key to people being well adjusted and maybe making a decision to not take drugs or certainly not get really stuck into them. So, I mean, that's my view. In terms of the links between the CFMEU and criminal motorcycle gangs and sadly the Australian Labor Party, well, I think it's there. The Labor Party don't seem to want to do anything about that. I got beaten to a pulp by the media in the 2015 state election, but those links are there, and we've got a Labor Party who sort of relaxed the whole sort of anti-bikie laws. You've got to sort of wonder why, who was really getting in their ears. But I guess my point again is, you know, you're talking, well, you've got a guy in front of you who was tough on them, you know, and we certainly pushed them out and back. I'm just saying to you, I just got to the point these days, it just ain't going to work. There's too much money at stake. We've got all these police resources deployed, going after this stuff, raiding labs, kicking down doors. You know, we've got the toughest laws we need. We've got a Crime and Corruption Commission who can haul people in, all normal sort of common law rights waived. You've got to answer. You can't be silent. If you're silent, you can be done for contempt, and they can stick you in a cell for a few days and bring you back in. We've got all the power we need. Why haven't we eradicated them?
We've just got time for one quick question. I think there was another man here. Yep.
Yeah, thanks very much for some great perspectives. Given the legalisation of cannabis in the US, I've heard from friends that you can order joints into your hotel room in San Francisco. Not that I'd know, but what it hasn't been mentioned here is the supply side. So we're talking about the demand side. So if we do decriminalise, legalise, however we want to, what puffery you want to put around it, how do we bring in that supply side of the equation so they're not being cooked up in shitty basements and all the rest of it? So how do we handle that side of it if we go down that route?
Well, I don't know if people noticed, I didn't really state a position, did I? I just asked us to challenge the status quo. So I'll put on the table to scare the living daylights out of a whole lot of people here. I'm actually legalise, regulate and tax. And mate, if you don't like that, maybe we've got to go to where David was saying. Can I just say one thing, by the way, about San Francisco? I was there a year ago with Lisa, who's here today, and it horrified us, the open use of drugs on the streets. I'm not advocating that. You know, you've got to establish norms with these things. If people want to take drugs in their home, comfort of their friends, at parties, that's fine. But openly smoking joints or shooting up on the streets of our cities and towns, same as walking down the street with a bottle of alcohol swinging from it, that's not on, and we can get the police to deal with things like that.
Thank you very much. Look, a challenging, an informative, a fantastic segment, and one that's bound to get discussion and thoughts going amongst the crowd. And I know there are lots of other questions, and I apologise that we can't get to them. So look, let's give a huge round of applause for our two speakers, Premier Campbell Newman and David Limbrick.